In looking at the trajectory of the tapes and watching Nixon's day-by-day behavior, I came to just a very realistic conclusion that Richard Nixon is just not as smart as I thought he was. He is clearly, his conversations about foreign policy, he's articulate, he knows the world, he's got clear thoughts, and he's brilliant in many regards. When he starts talking about domestic policy, there's very little he's good on. He bumbles, he stumbles, he's hesitant. The only exception to that, oddly enough, is finance. He's very good on the budget. He's got very strong feelings on spending. But most of his conversations are halting. He is stuttering, he is sputtering, and they're difficult. Acoustically, the Oval Office is pretty good. His telephone calls can be almost close to broadcast quality. His EOB, his Executive Office Building office, is terrible because the microphones are in the desk. They drilled holes in the desk. His Oval Office, which was Woodrow Wilson's desk, they put some holes right there in the sides and the front. I happened to always be sitting over a microphone when my voice was recorded, which actually I'm pleased with today to have, because I wasn't saying anything that didn't bother me. I was telling him exactly what the dire circumstances he was in. The EOB office is terrible because nobody sat near the desk. So they're very difficult to transcribe. And what we did and found, and I've talked to other people who've transcribed tapes now, and they all seem to stumble in this sooner or later. There's only one way to do this, and that's just, it's highly repetitive activity. You listen and you listen again, you listen, you change machines. I went out and actually digitized all of the archives tapes before the archives themselves had digitized them. You can manipulate that somewhat. You get distortions on the voices, but you can also pick up the words. So I got most of it. And my book is, of course, not a book of transcripts, but rather I drew narrative and dialogue out of these tapes. I would end up with 21 volumes of 3-inch notebooks that represent about 8,500 pages, roughly 4 million words of Nixon on Watergate. I told my editor, I'm not sure which was more difficult, the transcription to make the tapes or digesting them back down to a readable document. Nixon gets highly repetitive late in the game. There are two phases to Watergate. There is the cover-up, and then there is the cover-up of the cover-up. And that's when Nixon has jumped in with both feet. The taping system comes out during the start of the cover-up when when Alex Butterfield testifies, and Al Haig, who's White House Chief of Staff, had no idea that there was a voice-activated system. He knew Nixon had taped a few people, principally me, but he did not know he had a voice-activated system, and Haig just can't believe the President of the United States let every word get recorded. So for this political history, as it happens, I had probably the most remarkable primary source any author could ever have. I was able to, let me kind of wrap up my session on a couple stories about the tapes. I'm able to hear things. I couldn't listen because of the volume to every single conversation. I could immediately tell from my transcriber's work if he or she was having any trouble. If it was a difficult conversation. If it was a good one, I trusted it. Unless something was particularly important, I would tend to look at that, and just to make sure that I heard what they heard. But I often heard things that they could not hear because of not because of my great hearing, but because I knew the players. A wonderful example is an incident that occurs with Mark Felt, who, as we later knew, as Deep Throat, Bob Woodward's principal source. In October of 1972, I had gone over to the criminal division at the Department of Justice to talk to Henry Peterson, the head of the department, and the person responsible day by day for Watergate. And Henry said, "John, I haven't told the Attorney General this, who was Dick Kleinies. I haven't told the acting director of the FBI, Pat Gray, because I'm worried they'll overreact to this. But you should know, I think the White House should understand, that part of the reason this FBI investigation is being handled the way it is that the number two man who's in charge of it, Mark Felt, is leaking." I said, "How do you know that, Henry?" He said, "Well, I've known Felt for a long time. In fact, he's known by those of us who know him, not to his face, but behind his back, as the White Rat." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, he's prematurely gray, and he talks all the time to the papers." So Henry said, "I wasn't surprised to learn he was leaking." But I said, he told me the person I learned he was leaking from was the general counsel of a major publisher of this kind of information. I've narrowed it down to it's either Time magazine, where actually Felt gave better material than he gave to Woodward, or the Washington Post. But the general counsel of one of those is the place Henry got this. And he had given this person a commitment not to reveal his identity. So that was pretty good information. I took that information back to Haldeman, not knowing what he'd do with it, but I realized when I was listening to the tapes that he shared it with Nixon. This is one where Stanley Cutler had done a partial transcript on it, and so I looked at at Stanley's transcript, and then was listening to the tape. And there's one point in the conversation where the president is reacting to what Haldeman's told him. He said, "You know what I would do with Felt, Bob?" And then Cutler has an expletive following that. So he just drops out, which is not a surprise. But I hear something totally different. And everybody who's listened to the tape since they've heard what I say is there agrees. What he says, "You know what I would do with Felt, Bob? Ambassadorship." This is exactly what he'll do with Helms, the head of the CIA. He'll appoint him an ambassador to move him out on a very friendly term so that he's still loyal and what have you. This never went anywhere. In fact, that's one of the interesting things on the tapes and in these conversations, where Nixon raises some really interesting things that Haldeman never shares with anybody else. So the tapes there is no question today in Watergate that I really don't think I know the answer to, or the answer isn't found in those tapes. It was a grinding exercise. One of the most difficult parts of the book was Nixon gets compulsively obsessive about the conversations and starts repeating himself, where he'll make a little spin differently here or a little change there as he repeats these conversations, often with the same person, but with somebody else over and over and over again towards the end. And I couldn't burden the reader with that, but I wanted to give the reader a sense of how this man operated. So with those opening remarks, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Rick Perlstein, whose works I enjoy. He and I have had the pleasure of doing programs before. It's always reassuring to see really good young historians coming along and getting these stories right, because too many of them never do the digging of the kind that Rick does and get it wrong. So with that, Rick, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It's one of the great joys of my life, an unexpected joy to be able to call John Dean a friend. I like to say that without this guy, Richard Nixon would still be president. Also, I want to say something about the hospitality of the Miami Book Festival. It's been amazing. Someone said that they treat us guys like rock stars, and I feel like I've been swaddled with all the comforts of home, everything except for my morning banana muffin. If I had that, the day would be complete. John tells the story of many of the same years I write about here, very much from the inside, the fly in the wall. And our books complement each other very nicely because I tell the story of some of those same months from the outside. If you raised your hand when John asked you if you followed Watergate, this book is about you. You guys are the subject of this book, not the fellas in that house on Pennsylvania Avenue. And basically, this is a book about how the American people absorbed and responded to the traumas, and that's a word I use advisedly, the traumas of the years of 1973 and 1974 and 1975. And rather than kind of explaining that extempore, I will read a little bit from the book, set the table for what it's about, and I will very, very much look forward to the discussion we're having. And like John, I would be very glad to have emails, or if you prefer, join my Facebook clan at Rick Perlstein. I think I got 800 more spots before they max me out. We have all kinds of lively conversations. So without further ado, this is a book about how Ronald Reagan came within a hair's breadth of winning the 1976 Republican nomination for the presidency. But it is also about much more. In the years between 1973 and 1976, America suffered more wounds to its ideal of itself than at just about any other time in its history. First, in January of 1973, when Richard Nixon declared America's role in the Vietnam War over after some 8 years of fighting, or maybe 10 years of fighting, or maybe 4 years of fighting. It depends on how you count it. Thanks, brother. Some 58,000 Americans dead. $699 billion expended in American treasure. This Nixon called peace with honor. But that just obscured the fact that America had lost its first war. Then, almost immediately, televised hearings on the complex of presidential abuses known as Watergate, which revealed the men entrusted with the White House as little better or possibly worse than common criminals, in what one senator called a national funeral that just goes on day after day after day. Then, in October, came the Arab oil embargo, and suddenly Americans learned that the commodity that underpinned their lifestyle was vulnerable to shortages. And the world's mightiest economy could be held hostage by some mysterious cabal of third world sheikhs. You know, reading about and studying the energy crisis, one of the most striking and shocking things was people didn't even really think of energy as a thing, as something that was subject to the law of supply and demand. It was like the air and the water. And the real trauma of 1973 was, oh my God, this entire new category of things to worry about that we couldn't even imagine worrying about before. Now, this list omits some dozen of smaller traumas in between. One of my favorites, lost to everyday historical memory, was the near doubling of prices of meat in the spring of 1973, when the president's consumer advisor went on TV and informed viewers that liver, kidney, brains, and heart can be made into gourmet meals with seasoning, imagination, and more cooking time. The letters were unprintable in response to the White House. In the next few years, the traumas continued, compounding. The end of a presidency accompanied by fears Richard Nixon might seek to hold on office by force of arms. Inflation such as America had never known during peacetime. A recession that saw hundreds of blue-collar workers idled during Christmas time. Crime at a volume and ghastliness greater, according to one observer, than at any other time since the 15th century. And when I have the slideshow, this is where the Tanya, Patty Hearst goes up there with her machine gun and the seven-headed snakes. Senate and House hearings on the Central Intelligence Agency that accused American presidents since Dwight Eisenhower of commanding squads of lawless assassins. With these traumas, and this is where you guys come in, emerged a new sort of American politics, a stark discourse of reckoning. What kind of nation were we to suffer such humiliations, so suddenly, so unceasingly, so unexpectedly? A few pages hence, you will read these words from one expert. For this first time, Americans have had at least a partial loss in the fundamental belief in ourselves. We've always believed we were the new men, the new people, the new society, the last best hope on earth, in Lincoln's terms. For the first time, we've begun to doubt that. And that was only in February of 1973. By 1976, a presidential year, such observations would become so routine that when the nation geared up for a massive celebration of its bicentennial, it was common for editorialists and columnists to question whether America deserved to have a birthday party and whether the party could come off without massive bloodshed, given that there had been 89 bombings attributed to terrorism by the FBI in 1975. The liberals at the New Republic reflected upon the occasion of the most harrowing 1975 trauma, the military collapse of our ally South Vietnam, the nation on behalf of which we had expended those billions of dollars and thousands of lives, that, quote, if the bicentennial helps us focus on the contrast between our idealism and our crimes, so much the better. Now, the most ambitious politicians endeavored to speak to this new national mood. An entire class of them, dubbed the Watergate babies, were swept into Congress in 1975, pledging a thoroughgoing reform of America's broken institutions. And nearly alone among ambitious politicians, Ronald Reagan took a different road. Returning to the nation's attention toward the end of his second term as America's governor, as pundits began speculating about which Republican might succeed Richard Nixon, and then, thanks to John, which ones might succeed his replacement, Gerald Ford, Reagan, whenever he was asked about Watergate, insisted it said nothing important about America at all. Asked about Vietnam, he'd only say that the dishonor was that America had not expended enough violence. That, quote, the greatest immorality is to ask young men to fight or die for my country. If it's not a cause, we are willing to win. One of the quotes he liked to repeat in those years came from Pope Pius XII, writing in Collier's magazine in 1945, back when the United States was on top of the world. The Pope said, the American people have a genius for great and unselfish deeds. Into the hands of America, God has placed the destiny of an afflicted mankind. He would repeat that in almost every speech. Now, when Ronald Reagan began getting attention for talking this way in America's season of melancholy, Washington's touts cited him only to dismiss him. No one who called the Watergate burglars not criminals at heart, as Ronald Reagan had in the spring of 1973, could be taken seriously as a political comer. But a central theme of my previous two books, chronicling conservatism's ascent in American politics, has been the myopia of pundits, who so frequently fail to notice the very cultural ground shifting beneath their feet. In fact, at every turn in America's reckoning with its apparent decline, there were always dissenting voices from the right. They said things like, Richard Nixon just couldn't be a bad guy, and that America just couldn't be surrendering its role as God's chosen nation. Not possible. At first, such voices sounded mainly in the interstices of America's political discourse, in letters to the editor. Among right-wing institution builders whose industriousness exploiting the cultural confusions of the 70s were being largely ignored. In conservative churches, whose pews grew more crowded even as experts insisted that religious belief was in radical decline. I found a quote, an AP article by the AP's religion editor that quoted a very distinguished professor of religion saying, "Christians must accept being in a definite minority for the time being." Another bad prediction. But those voices were moving from the margin to the center. This was related to what Ronald Reagan was accomplishing politically. But things shifted independently of him as well. Read one wire service headline about the bicentennial celebration. Nation's hunger to feel good erupts in a fever of patriotism. The keynote of articles like this, which were common, was surprise. Surprise that it wasn't that hard to unapologetically celebrate America after all. And this book is how that shift in American political and cultural sentiment began. It is also a sort of biography of Ronald Reagan. He had been a sullen little kid from a chaotic, alcoholic home whose mother's passion for saving fallen souls could never save her own husband. It also seemed to have kept her out of the house almost constantly. And by the time of Ronald Reagan's adolescence, the boy who told his friends to call him Dutch had cultivated an extraordinary gift in the act of rescuing himself. The ability to radiate blithe optimism in the face of what others called chaos. To reimagine moments, the morass in front of him, as a tableau of simple moral clarity. He did the same thing decades later as a politician, skillfully reframing situations that those of a more critical temper saw as irresolvable muddles, like the Vietnam War, as crystalline black and white melodramas. This was a key to what made others feel so good about him, what made them so eager and willing to follow him, what made him a leader. But it was also simultaneously what made him such a controversial leader. Others, witnessing precisely this quality, saw him as a phony and a hustler. In this book, Ronald Reagan is not a uniter, he is fundamentally a divider. And understanding the precise ways that opinion about him divided Americans better helps us understand our political order of battle today. The pattern emerged extraordinarily early. In 1966, when Reagan, the TV host and former actor in B movies, shocked the political universe by winning the Republican nomination for California governor. A young aspiring journalist began researching a profile of him that never got published because no one was much interested in Ronald Reagan. Industriously, though, the journalist tracked down acquaintances who had attended tiny Eureka College in central Illinois with Reagan, or taught him there, in the years between 1928 and 1932. I just learned that Miami-Dade has 170,000 students. Eureka had about 200 or 300. The divergent recollections of Reagan mapped precisely about how they would if you corralled a random sample of politically attuned citizens today. Half remembered him as a hero and a figure of destiny, and half judged him as precisely the opposite, as shallow at best, a manipulative fraud at worst. So before Reagan had served a single day in political office, a polarity of opinion was set, and it endured forevermore. On one side, those who saw him as a rescuer, a hero, a redeemer. On the other, those who saw him as a goat. Read a handwritten get-well note he received after the 1981 assassination attempt against him. It referred to his first job as, of course, a youthful lifeguard. This was a handwritten note that he got in the Oval Office. I met you in the 20s in Lowell Park, Illinois. Do you remember the good times we had in the 20s? You were 17 years old then, and everyone called you Dutch. Please get well soon. We need you to save this country. Remember all the lives you saved in Lowell Park. The letter appears in a religious biography of Reagan that argues that his coming into the world, culminating with his single-handed defeat of the Soviet Empire, was literally providential, the working out of God's plan. On the other side, those who found Reagan a phony, a fraud, a toady. The first time such an opinion of Reagan shows up in the historical record is in his high school yearbook. He's depicted fishing a suicide out of the water, who begs, "Don't rescue me, I want to die." Reagan responds, "Well, you'll have to postpone that. I need a medal." Like the Reagan worship, the Reagan hate lives on. I wanted to share this manuscript with a friend of mine who grew up in California in the 60s and 70s. She told me I'd best not send it. She couldn't think straight about Ronald Reagan for her rage. Her beef, and that of millions of others, was simple: that all that turbulence in the 60s and 70s had given the nation a chance to finally reflect critically upon its power, to shed its arrogance, to become a more humble and better citizen of the world, to grow up. For these citizens, what Reagan achieved foreclosed that imperative, that Americans might learn to question leaders ruthlessly, throw aside the silly notion that American power was always innocent, think like grown-ups. They had been proposing a new definition of patriotism, one built on questioning authority and unsettling ossified norms. I think some of those guys are in the audience today. Then along came Ronald Reagan, encouraging citizens, in this estimation, to think like children, waiting for a man on horseback to rescue them, and that this was a tragedy. The division was present even among his own offspring. Maureen, his eldest, who became a Republican activist, wrote of the time her father as governor missed one more in a train of important milestones in her life. She cast it in the most optimistic possible terms. I think Dad always regretted times like these, at least a little bit, the way the tug and pull of his public life kept him from enjoying firsthand the successes of his children. Oh, he enjoyed them with us in spirit, and he was always there for us emotionally. At the other pole, there was his other daughter, Patty, who disagreed. Patty, a rock and rolling liberal, wrote, "I had been taught to keep secrets, to keep our image intact for the world. Under our family's definition of loyalty, the public should never see that under carefully preserved surface was a group of people who knew how to inflict wounds and then convincingly say, those wounds never existed." This gets to my favorite Ronald Reagan story. It's in Patty Davis's memoir. She writes very, very damning things about her mother, Nancy Reagan. And she was suffering horrible depression. She's one of Reagan's two children who apparently attempted or thought about attempting suicide. She was in college. No, I think she was back in California at the time. Maybe she was in college. And she wanted to go into therapy. But Nancy and Ronald thought that that was for people who were crazy or whatever it was. And so what she did was she got hold of a pound of marijuana. And she sold it. And that paid for her therapy. While her dad was the governor and the future Just Say No, First Lady of California. None the wiser. She wrote of how her mother, Nancy, beat her, was addicted to pills, and used their house's state-of-the-art intercom system installed by General Electric, their corporate benefactor, as a tool for Orwellian surveillance. Now, Maureen described that same intercom system as a providential gift. Writing of the time, it broadcast the sound of little Ron, the youngest, crashing to the floor in the nursery, allowing them to save his life. Now we get to the political part. Call Maureen's version denial, and liberals are always accusing conservatives of a politics of being in denial. Call Patty a cynic, always seeing everything in a negative light, and God knows conservatives are always accusing liberals of doing that. Optimism, pessimism, America the innocent, America the compromised. These have become two of the incommensurate polarities that structure the very left-right order of battle in American political life, as much as the debate over the role of government, led by Barry Goldwater, and the culture war between mutually incriminating cultural sophisticates on the one hand and the plain, earnest, silent majority on the other, that I labeled in my previous book, Nixon land. Note well that Reagan's side in this political battle of affect, which is carried out far above the minutiae of policy debates and electoral tallies, has prevailed. Listen to Liz Cheney in 2009 speaking for the Republican multitudes. I believe unequivocally, unapologetically, that America is the best nation that ever existed in history, and clearly that it exists today. And here is Mitt Romney, accepting the Republican nomination in 2012, speaking of the day he watched Neil Armstrong land on the moon. Like all Americans, we went to bed that night knowing we lived in the greatest country in the world. I think there were some people in 1969 who might have gone to bed thinking differently. But in that formulation, they're not really Americans after all. This is from a couple years ago. A Google search for Mitt Romney and greatest nation in the history of the earth just yielded me 114,000 hits. Now, such utterances are meant to be an ideological reproach to Democrats, always supposedly apologizing for America. Remember that one, apologizing for America. Obama's going abroad to apologize for America. If only. Here was San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro's keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in 2012. Ours is a nation like no other. No matter where you come from or who you are, the path is always forward. The First Lady, Michelle Obama, spoke of her campaign journeys. Every day they make me proud. Every day they remind me how blessed we are to live in the greatest nation on earth. Then her husband, accepting the nomination. We keep our eyes fixed on a distant horizon, knowing that Providence is with us and that we are surely blessed to be citizens of the greatest nation on earth. Now, this is interesting. Here's Samantha Power, the Harvard scholar of genocides, at her confirmation hearings early in 2013, questioned about a magazine article she published a decade earlier in which she wrote that American foreign policy needed, quote, a historical reckoning with crimes committed, sponsored, or permitted by the United States. That's the kind of stuff people were really thinking about in the 70s. Senator Marco Rubio, oh, you guys might know that cat, Republican of Florida, demanded to know what crimes she was referring to. She would respond, only, America is the greatest country in the world, and we have nothing to apologize for. This is a book about how such rhetoric came into being and how such hubris comes now to define us. In certain ways, we live in some of the darkest times in our history. Global warming threatens to engulf us. Political polarization threatens to paralyze us. The economy nearly collapsed because of the failure of the banking regulatory regime. Competition from China threatens to overwhelm us. Social mobility is at its lowest point in generations, to name only a few versions of the national apocalypse that yet may come. But at the same time, somehow, something like an official cult of optimism, the greatest nation in the history of the earth, saturates the land. How did it happen? This is one of the questions the invisible bridge poses. Here is another. What does it mean to believe in America? To wave a flag? Or to struggle towards a more searching alternative to the flag wavers? During the years covered in these pages, Americans debated this question with an intensity unmatched before or since, even if they didn't always know that this is what they were doing. I hope this volume might become a spur to renewing that debate in these years, at a time that cries for reckoning once more, in a nation that has ever so adored its own innocence, and so dearly wishes to see itself as an exception to history. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Stick around. We've got some great questions. I mean, these are really fascinating questions.
Before you go with your questions, can I ask Rick a question?
Absolutely, Mr. Dean and Mr.
And
Wilson. Go
I
ahead.
get one too.
Go ahead. You start your questions to each other.
I'm very curious if Rick has discovered from his research if the current polarization of this country politically begins with Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, or does it start earlier or later?
I'm going to date it to the Constitutional Convention. It's one of the ways we so dearly wish to see ourselves as exception to history, as a society at peace with itself. We have a tendency of announcing such things right before the biggest conflicts begin. I write about it in all my books. But just quickly, I mean, if you think about it,
I might debate that with you, but I won't today.
we wouldn't have a republic were it not for a compromise between the slave states to the south and the mercantilist states to the north, which was papers over this gash, this wound within the body, the national body, over slavery, over race, and it's sufficiently traumatic that when it finally comes to a fore in the 1860s, of course, hundreds of thousands of Americans slaughter each other. Well, Congress was trying to prevent that in the 1850s. They passed a gag rule. You're not allowed to debate slavery on the floor of the House or the Senate. If we just don't talk about it, maybe it'll go away. That's a very signal American move. And we see it, for example, we should probably give recognition that today is November 22nd, the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. And one of the things that made that event, it would have been traumatic in any event, but the idea that America was an exception, that Europe was the places where they settled politics in the streets through violence, right? The third world. And in fact, right before that, in my first book, Before the Storm, I quote a pundit, I think it was Walter Lippmann, saying America is more united and at peace with itself than at any time in history. Well, if we could kind of write into the script of how we understood America that we do have these profound divisions, and they're not just going to go away with a wave of the hand and a lofty rhetoric of there is no red America, there is no blue America, maybe we'd have a better time of it when the traumas finally come. My question for John on this anniversary. One of the things, when he testified before the Irvin Committee in 1973, and with his beautiful wife behind him and those nerdy glasses on his eyes, 75%, I learned from him, of American television sets were tuned in. And one of the things that was so fascinating, you might say traumatizing to the nation, was a portrait of the culture of the White House he depicted. How thin-skinned Nixon was, how obsessed they were with protesters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One part of that was Nixon's obsession with the fair-haired boy, Kennedy. So maybe you can tell us your experiences about how Nixon thought about John F. Kennedy.
Right. It's interesting, that little bit of testimony, and that certainly wasn't the focus of my testimony, where I explained the atmosphere at the Nixon White House. I later read in the Nixon memoirs where he thought and felt that was the most devastating part of the testimony. He said, we could never recover from that because it happened to be true and it was fairly damning. Nixon's preoccupation with the Kennedys is obviously the aftermath of the 1960 contest he'd had where he and Jack Kennedy had run for the presidency. They actually personally had a fairly friendly relationship. They had been in the Senate at the same time. They'd arrived at the Senate at the same time. And I think there was a certain mutual regard. It wasn't Jack Kennedy as much as Bobby and Teddy Kennedy that troubled him. He was quite convinced that he was going to see in his re-election bid Teddy Kennedy step forward. He always read people like Muskie, if not McGovern, when they were vying for the nomination as stalking horse that might well just step aside if Kennedy came into play. So he never lets up. and until almost the bitter end in his fascination and really no holds barred ongoing investigation of Teddy Kennedy. And I think after Chappaquiddick, he realized that the prospects of Teddy running were certainly minimal, but he did everything he could to collect information about Chappaquiddick, which happened before I got to the White House, but I was regaled with some of the things they had done as sort of his belts and braces that he would be ready. Anyway, we've got questions from the audience.
Sure. We got a few questions here. First one is to Mr. Perlstein. Please discuss how much more conservative Reagan was than compared to Nixon.
Oh, then compared to Nixon, every time I do a talk, someone asks, well, if Reagan was around now, wouldn't he be a moderate Republican, or wouldn't they kick him out of the Republican Party for being too liberal? This question is a little sharper, I think, actually. I think, I'd be interested to know if John agrees, but I think that politicians have to operate according to the contexts that are given to them. They don't pick policies off the shelf. I mean, I've heard, if you go to the Nixon Library and go to the museum exhibit that they set up, his supporters set up, they'll say he was a great supporter of the environment. He signed the blah, blah, blah act, you know, the Hearts and Flowers and Clean Air and Clean Water and da-da-da act. And it turns out that that act had passed the House, 410 to 5. So it doesn't really show much of what he really believes in his heart. The question is, how conservative was he really? I think the best piece of evidence for that is the budget that he had prepared for FY 1974, which was seen as a very, very big deal at the time. Newsweek called it the most important political document since the New Deal. And it was basically a Reagan budget. It sought to defund all the agencies of the War on Poverty and the Great Society. And at that point, he also appointed new right activist Howard Phillips to be the head of the Economic Opportunity Commission, which was the agency that administered the War on Poverty. And his job was to do what people were commissioned to do during the Reagan administration, which was dismantle the agencies that they had been hired to ostensibly run. And in fact, in his memoir, he says, after my reelection, which of course he won, 49 states, I made haste to, continue my mandate to build this new majority, which was the majority of what later became Reagan Democrats and Catholics and Southerners and all the rest. So I think he wanted to be Reagan, but was arrested in his march to the right by, this guy. Yeah. Do you agree?
I think basically I do. In fact, in some regards, I think he was more conservative than Reagan.
He certainly didn't have the heart for racial equality that Reagan had.
No, not at all. And he, things like EPA, he would tell, you can hear on the tapes where he would talk to somebody like Ehrlichman, who would be active in some of these more moderate, if not progressive, domestic policies, where he had no interest in them. He would say, just don't get me in trouble politically, and go ahead and do what you want to. He has almost no interest in these domestic issues.
He called domestic politics outhouses in Peoria. He wanted to rewrite the chessboard of the world. And he was incredibly politically cynical. He supported what became known as affirmative action and something called the Philadelphia Plan. And the reason he supported it was he thought it would be great because if he could get Democratic unions and Democratic African Americans at each other's throats, he could rip apart and destroy the Democratic Party, which was his goal quite explicitly.
Right.
Great. Mr. Dean, this question's for you. Why exactly were the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee broken into? Was it merely a fishing expedition, or was there something specific being sought?
Yeah, that's one of the things as I went through the tapes. In fact, there's an appendix in the book where every time,
Excellent one.
Every time I found something in the tapes where they talk about their knowledge of why the break-in occurred, I put a footnote for the appendix. And then I collected them all in the appendix, which doesn't really explain all I know about why they went in there, but it explains everything they knew. And it's pretty clear that they understood it was a fishing expedition to get financial information on Larry O'Brien. If you go beyond what I've done to all the sworn testimony from the Cuban Americans who were the burglars, from Howard Hunt, who gave them their orders. If you just go through the entirety of what happened contemporaneously, you'll find that's what they were doing. They were on a fishing expedition, and it becomes quite clear. Because it was so bungled, a lot of people think there must have been something more going on. The conspiracy theories have developed over the fact that it was so bungled because there are holes and in unexplained factors that they create facts just don't really exist. The bungling was human error, plain and simple, and not part of some other conspiracy.
Thank you. Mr. Perlstein, this one I think is great for you. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it. How did Reagan give voice to sentiments that were in the past deemed too extreme to be taken seriously? Quashing unions, demonizing the poor, demonizing the social programs begun by FDR and continued through the Great Society?
You know, it's an excellent question, and it's very central to the core of why he was able to succeed politically where someone like Barry Goldwater wasn't able to succeed. One of the things I did in my research was I went to the Hoover Institute in California and listened to all his radio broadcasts that he made after he was governor. That was kind of his profession. He would make these 3-minute radio broadcasts every day, and I call them homilies. They're very kind of sermon-like. And one of the things he's so good at is what I call a liturgy of absolution. He tells people who think poor people are getting too much money that black folks maybe are, at the federal trough. He was the first person I can find who describes black voters as living on the Democrats' plantation. He said that in 1968. People who are concerned about crime. People who are concerned about union power. And he's so good at kind of metaphorically looking them in the eye, of course he's on the radio, or literally looking them in the eye and saying, you are not a bad person. And his rhetorical gift, and you'll have to see in the book how he does it, was to say either, he'll say, I was an FDR Democrat, and I understand what this is all about, and these are all humane ends that people are attempting. These are good people. Sometimes they're bad people. But they just don't understand that they're going to achieve the opposite of what they intend. Or, it turns out, and he's very good at quoting surveys, and he doesn't identify the survey, and you can't really kind of check him one way or the other, that there was a survey of black people in Washington, D.C., and they want, 70% of them want tougher crime laws and no-knock warrants and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're going to tell you that you're a racist. They're going to say that law and order is a code word for racism. But this proves that maybe they're the racists. And he was so good at that, and he was so good at enveloping his audience into feeling good about themselves for doing things that a previous generation were seen as politically beyond the pale.
Thank you. We have one final question, Mr. Dean. I'm going to make it a two-part question for you, if that's okay. We're going to end up in a couple of minutes. First of all, what are your thoughts about the campaign intelligence gathering that occurs in today's campaigns and also the money spent on the ads? And I'd like to end it with, if Watergate had not happened, what do you think you'd be doing today? So we'll start with part one, and then we'll go to part two.
Right. He'd be president.
I didn't hear the last
The first part was about campaign intelligence gathering today that occurs in today's campaigns and all the money that's spent on ads. What are your thoughts about that?
It doesn't even seem comparable today. While it clearly goes on, it is not the same sort of rough and tumble that at least it has not surfaced on any broad basis, certainly not out of a White House anyway, or at the presidential level, where they're planting secretaries, they're wiretapping, or they're trying to deliberately manipulate a campaign where you'll get the candidate you want to run against rather than the one who might surface out of the primary system. So it's a little different, and that's probably one of the aftermaths of Watergate and one of the lessons of Watergate, that people really want the system to work fairly, and not unfairly. So I don't see it. I've never seen anything quite comparable to Watergate in the years since. As far as the other question, what would I be doing without Watergate? Well, I'd still be married to Mo. That's the, the best part of it. And I had never planned to make a career out of government. I had, in fact, tried to resign from the White House in September of '71, which was long before Watergate. I'd been on a vacation and I'd had a couple very attractive job offers. They related to my being associated and having good terms with the administration. And when I I'd explained both to Haldeman, the chief of staff, and said I'd like to leave. I said my deputy, a fellow by the name of Fred Fielding, who would later become Reagan's counsel and then Bush's counsel, I said, Fred's quite capable of handling this job, so these opportunities are something I'd like to pursue. He said to me, he said, John, you can't leave. You owe it to us to stay. In fact, if you leave, you'll be a persona non grata, and just basically blowing away the jobs. I suspected years later he wished he'd let me go. But I stayed. So I have actually pretty much done, post-Watergate, what I set out to do, and have had a lot of fun. I returned to writing after a successful career in business, which was basically working in mergers and acquisitions. Had a lot of fun. I'd gone back to school and studied accounting. I almost sat for the CPA, but I decided, no, I really don't want to do that. But I needed the skills and the knowledge. And a couple of partners I've found there's something really important where you're lucky if you find the right wife or you find the right business partners, and I was blessed by both. I had great business partners, and we had a lot of fun and did very well at what we did. But I was able to retire at 60 and return to something I'd always wanted to do, and I'm now on my 8th book in retirement. So I've done pretty much what I wanted.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Mr. Dean, Mr. Perlstein, on behalf of this wonderful audience and the Miami Book Fair, thank you so much for a great, great conversation.